checks all right?
Yep.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Dan's okay? All right, watch your... Usually we have to be careful of the plosives a little. I think I'd get it away a little bit, Dan. Dan tends to speak up into the microphone. He tends to swallow the microphone.
Loud.
Loud and into the microphone.
At Cedar Point, they keep turning the mic down on me.
Need plosives, okay?
One more time.
Okay,
Okay,
I'll
testing.
talk about this loud when I get started because I get revved up as I go along.
I'll be talking about this loud right here.
Okay,
Try
that's
some
fine.
P's, Dan.
P.
Plosives.
Plosives. Yo.
That's all right. I've got
Okay.
the wind.
Scott Peck.
That's right. Okay, let's do it, Jim. Let's do it. You give me a sign, huh? Well, Dan, I'm glad that we have the opportunity to talk. It's strange that we have been co-pastors at Corpus Christi Parish all of these years and haven't done a radio program yet, but I think now we'll have a chance to talk a bit on the air. I want to talk about a book, The Road Less Traveled by Dr. M. Scott Peck. And one of the reasons I asked you to be on the program was that I know you have taught courses on this book, and so that I thought it would be interesting to see a bit of how students have responded to it in the groups that you have dealt with. Have you found the book to be a popular one?
Very popular. In fact, it always amazes me how many people are interested in delving into this particular book. They seem to be, each time they read it, they seem to be finding more insights. Besides the people that have taken the courses that I've offered, there have been lots of other people who would have liked to taken that, and are going to, at some point, I'm sure, find the time to really delve into that. I've read the book.
It's probably one of the most popular books around these days, The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck, and I think that it really is worth exploring a bit to see what he has to say. He, of course, is a practicing psychiatrist himself. He got his M.D. from Case Western Reserve Medical School, and he is in practice and draws a lot on his work as a therapist. But he comes up with very traditional notions of the spiritual life and what that quest is all about. In fact, it's almost humorous to me in a way to read his book and to see this traditional wisdom that we've held in the Christian community all these centuries to be brought out and to be put into a psychological framework. It's almost as though through Scott Peck people are rediscovering the traditional wisdom of the church. Let's look a bit at what he has to say. The book's really divided up into 4 parts. He talks about discipline, he talks about love, religion, and grace. Right away, those are strange topics, it seems, for a psychotherapist to be dealing with. So I'd like to, during our time together now, to talk about that notion of discipline that he has. And he sees that as really crucial to the whole process of spiritual growth. He thinks that without self-discipline, we're just never going to make it. And I guess he sets the frame in this way, that he understands that life is painful, that life is filled with suffering. It's a very Buddhist notion. That's the first noble truth in Buddhism, that life is pain. And Scott Peck thinks that we have to begin with that premise if we're ever going to function properly.
And I think in light of that, he really delves into the idea that the greatest measure of a person's greatness is really one's capacity for suffering or for dealing with the pain and the difficulty of life, which, as you say, comes out of the Buddhist tradition. That's the first line of the book. Life is difficult.
Yeah.
And then goes on to talk about how perhaps we've been deceived to believe that it's otherwise, and that our real strength comes from our ability to accept that and then to find ways to deal with that effectively.
Right, so that he starts out with the idea that life is filled with problems, and that our difficulties are when we try to escape from that, when we don't accept that. And I think your point is well taken. It's a cultural problem, isn't it? It's the sense that life ought to be easy, or I expect it to be easy, or when we get married, everything will sail along nicely, or I should be able to make it through school without really studying very hard, or we should be able to minister effectively without planning and so on. There really is something built into our culture that says that life ought to flow smoothly and easily. And in fact, a lot of modern talk in the psychological world seems to move in that direction. That's what seems so countercultural in a way about Peck's book. It goes against a lot of the common wisdom these days. So he's starting out, life is painful, there's problems involved, and in fact life is sort of one continuing set of problems, one after another. And he thinks that mental illness really results from failing to see that the problem comes when we escape from the problems of life.
Trying to avoid all the various ways that we have in our society to avoid the problems of our life, at least attempting to try to do that.
All the escapisms, drink, and
even watching the soap operas.
Yes, right, which are incidentally filled with problems that people are dealing with. Of course, I think that as we see later on, he probably would understand in his notion of balance that at times we need to get away and to have our times of escape or vacation or whatever. But fundamentally, the thrust of what he wants to say is that we must begin to deal with the problems of life. And of course, his solution is that the great tool we have is this self-discipline. Discipline's the way that we can go about the business of handling the problems of life. And when he begins to talk about that, then he is into the business of saying, okay, now how would we do this? What are the specific ways of disciplining ourselves? And let's talk first of all about this idea of delayed gratification. What do you get out of that section, and what's he talking about there?
Well, it's interesting because this one really probably gets people's attention the most of all of them. Really a matter of putting off the pleasure of life and dealing with the nitty-gritty and the pain and the struggle of life, putting the pleasure off until a later time. Simple example of that kind of thing would be a parent saying to their child, you're not going to go out and play until you get your homework done, until you get your chores done around the house. That's a very simple example of delayed gratification.
In that way, they would be teaching the child, right, a pattern for life.
And he goes a lot into the patterns of parents and the whole question of parenting and the example, the modeling that takes place within the context of family in regard to this issue of delayed gratification. And once again, we get into a cultural thing. So many things in our society and our culture really warn against delayed gratification. Simple thing like a credit card. Why wait till you can afford to buy it? Put it on a credit card. You can buy it now, pay for it later, which is just the opposite of delayed gratification.
That's a good point, isn't it? Yeah. If you stop and think of the world of advertising, they are constantly bombarding us with the message that you better have it now, enjoy it now. And there's a whole lot of talk again in the psychotherapeutic world about that, of living in the now and grabbing all the gusto you can, and don't wait for any of that. Grab hold now because you might not get another shot at it. So again, there's all kind of messages that say don't go along with that. But one of the strengths of his book, I think, or the fascinations of it, this book, The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck, is that he brings up examples all the time. He uses examples from his practice as a therapist, and that really enriches his whole discussion and puts some flesh and blood on these general principles that he makes. And I recall, I'm not recalling the example precisely, but the idea was that people had an unpleasant task to do. I think it was this woman executive, and she would always do this unpleasant task at the end of the day. And all day long she was dreading that coming up, and she's anxious about it and so on. And so his simple example was, do the unpleasant task first, get it done in the first hour or two of the day, and then the rest of the day you can have it be more enjoyable. I must say I've learned that myself in my own life. I used to try to do my writing in the evening, and I don't like to write. It's a very hard discipline for me, terrible discipline. And I would rather do other kind of work like counseling and doing my class preparation or taking care of the liturgy or almost anything rather than do the writing. And if I waited till the end of the day, I was under constant pressure, dreaded that coming up. I was usually tired, couldn't really work at it effectively. So what I've tried to do is try to do my writing in the morning now, get it out of the way, and it's sort of a reward. If I get so much written by a certain time, then I let myself go on and do the next task. And I find that to be just a really good common sense kind of principle. The interesting thing he says about that the reason we can't delay gratification is because we don't feel loved. We don't feel that life can be trusted. Like we're not sure that if we wait, we'll ever get that pleasure. And I find that to be a fascinating insight of his, that you need to feel loved and have a proper sense of self-love before you can delay gratification. That's I think psychologically it's probably true. When you feel grasping, when you feel unworthy and so on, then there's always that sense, I better get it now, because if I wait, it just might not come to me.
You know, part of that too is the kind of modeling the parents have done in regard to that. It seems to me that parents who have really tried to teach children delayed gratification are really, in a sense, helping them to establish a more positive self-worth and self-appreciation. And I think a child who, and this is the interesting thing about adults discussing, say, an issue of delayed gratification in the context of a course or discussion group on this book, they begin to realize, for instance, that as they look back in their childhood, how their parents did or did not really show their love by disciplining them in that particular way, or trying to teach them that discipline, which in a sense really has either enhanced or not enhanced their own self-image based on that.
So the family relationships are really important this way. One of his claims is you can't learn delayed gratification unless you see it modeled in your parents.
That's right.
In some way.
The self-discipline role models is really the crucial factor in that.
Yeah. That's interesting. I can remember one Christmas when I got a baseball glove. I was just a little kid, and I waited to open that present, which I knew what it was, till last. And somehow that has seemed to me to be a model of this delayed gratification. I mean, I don't really know why I did that, but I presume it had something to do with something I learned from my parents. Now, I'm not putting that forward as some sort of great model, but it partakes of this idea somehow of delayed gratification. Well, Dan, one other thing I want to say about that before we go off, he makes a point in this section of taking time to solve problems, that sometimes people think that problems will go away by themselves. I won't look at it, I'll bury my head in the sand, and it will just sort of automatically get solved. And he makes a big thing out of saying, sit down and face it head on, get it solved, and then you can get on with your life.
That really, in his indication, is a sign of love. If we take the time to solve the problems or to interact with someone, he says that's one of the ways in which you really love.
Yes.
He says, well, take the time with those particular things that we really care about.
Yes, and that's a sign also both of love of others and of self-love.
That's
again,
right.
Because we are freeing ourselves from some tremendous burden. So, we're talking about spiritual growth. That's what, from a psychological point of view. How is it that we advance as a human being? And Scott Peck's big point is that we need to delay gratification if we're going to grow in the spiritual life. Now, the second of the four ways that he looks at this whole thing is in terms of accepting a proper responsibility for the problems that we're involved in. He warns us against accepting too much responsibility, as a neurotic would do. A neurotic would say, it's always my fault, I have to accept responsibility for everything. And then he talks about those with character disorders, those people who, for whom they won't accept the responsibility. They have too little sense of it. It's always somebody else's problem. Someone else caused this. It's my wife's problem. It's because she nags. That's why I blow my top. Or it's because those parishioners are not cooperative, and that's why I don't do my job properly as a clergy person. So, I mean, there's all kind of examples of this where we would throw it off on somebody else. And what he wants us to do is to accept this proper responsibility for the inevitable problems of life. I have to try to work to solve them.
I think one of the major areas in dealing with that whole business of accepting responsibility perhaps is related to the business of avoiding the pain of resolving our problems. We just don't take responsibility for resolving our problems. We want somebody else to solve them for us, and he delves into that and gives some examples from some of the cases of his practice.
I'm remembering an example that he gave of his own life in this section, and I don't know if I have the details in order, but it might have been a time when he was an intern or in medical school or something, and he was doing a lot of extra work, and he saw the other interns leaving earlier than he was, and so on, and he got all bent out of shape. He was real angry at them, and because they got off and he had to work. And so he sat down and began to look at this thing. And he said, well, I have to accept responsibility for the fact that I decided to do this extra work, that I was going to be more attentive to my patients, spend more time with them, visit them twice instead of once. Therefore, it was going to take me more time. And he said that in that he learned then to get over his anger at the other people and say it's not their fault that they're going home and having a good time when I'm working. And if I decided to do that extra work, then I have to put up with it. And I think that's so true throughout life. It's part of accepting proper responsibility is to live with the consequences of our actions.
It brings to mind the Martha and Mary story of the scriptures. You know, that's perhaps what Martha needed to do, in terms of coming to terms with the responsibility that she has assumed, instead of, wanting to say, well, tell her to help me, that kind of thing.
Yeah, perfect example, yeah. So if she decides she's going to do this work, then she better go ahead and do it. And I think that is so often the case. I mean, we do create our life situations by our decisions, and therefore we really need to live with those things. So I've accepted not long ago the task to write a book, and so I have all these chapters due, and so I have to live with that. I have to try to remember that it's not someone else's fault that I'm sitting there writing that chapter. I'm the one who agreed to do it. Right. And so there really is little sense complaining about it. I ought to just get on with it. And if I don't want to do it, then decide not to, and to get out of it. So I find, again, his points often seem so obvious in a way, and yet I really find a certain uncommon wisdom in them. It rings a lot of bells with me, I know.
I think, in counseling we deal with lots of people who are trying to avoid responsibility for their own life. They want somebody else to solve their problem for them. And it seems to me, and this is one of the major points he makes, that when we avoid responsibility for our lives, for our behavior, for our problems, we're giving away our power. We're surrendering true freedom. We really lose our freedom.
That's a good point. Yeah, and we do see this throughout life. People wanting to give that power away. And I think that, what this all reminds me of is the great analysis of freedom made by John Paul Sartre, when he said that we are condemned to be free. That's a theme in existentialist thought picked up by a lot of theologians. We're condemned to be free, which means that our freedom is a burden. It's a terrible burden, because now we know we're responsible for ourselves, responsible to make ourselves what we will be forever, responsible for dealing with our own problems. And that's heavy, and that's one of the things that creates anxiety in the modern world. We now have all these options. Most people who existed in the history of the world were trying to survive. They didn't have the kind of options we have. And now we live in this kind of world, and freedom has become a burden. It weighs heavily on our shoulders, and there's, I think, always a temptation to escape it in one way or another. I notice very often in the book when Peck will give an example, he will then make the point that example, while it may be extreme, also applies to all of us, that we can probably all find tendencies in our own life along that line. And so here he's saying freedom is a burden, and the real call for the self-disciplined person is to accept that, to live with that freedom, and in the midst of sort of a constant temptation to escape from it.
I might just make a comment here about, I think one of the reasons why the book rings rings true to people's life and experiences, because it gives them a chance, through the examples that are used there, to really delve into their own sense of that particular area, for in dealing with these disciplines, for instance. As people read examples of avoiding responsibility, or the way people have assumed too much responsibility, they're really, in a sense, forced to take a look at their own life and say, how do I deal with responsibility, and where do I want to change my approach to that? I think that's why it rings so true.
Usually hit true? Do people pick up on the examples in the classes?
Yeah, I think the examples really, that's what I think is the real success of the book. The examples that have been used somehow are touching base with people's experience, and it really brings to the surface their own experiences in regard to that particular issue.
That's interesting. I mean, I know it's not terribly surprising, because I think it very often is the concrete flesh and blood kind of example that we can latch on to rather than general principles. Dan, let's go on to the third of his 4 tools or aspects of discipline that he wants us to use in dealing with life's problems. And the third one is dedication to reality. He talks about all of us having our own map, which I often call an interpretive scheme, or a way of looking at life, a general approach to life. And he insists that this map has to be some approaching reality. And since reality is often changing and is always evolving, it's necessary to revise our map. By map, I mean there this fundamental grid through which we look at life, the categories that determine what we see and what we miss, what we treasure about life. So he says we all got this map, and we have to try to make sure this interpretive scheme of ours is somehow in tune with reality. But then that means that we're going to have to always be changing it if we're revising, if we're going to function effectively in the world. So this third one is dedication to reality, dedication to truth, to being in touch with the world as it really is and not as we would like it to be.
And I think the real challenge in that regard is a matter of getting in touch with our own experience. The process begins with very stringent self-examination, a process, in my estimation, which is a lot more painful than examining the world around us, to really get in touch with ourselves, what our maps really are, and what kind of revision needs to be made in those maps. He says it's a process of constantly revising, continuously revising. Somewhere along the road, so many people have stopped revising the maps. They're operating on maps that were really helpful 20 years ago, but not today.
Right.
And that's where the difficulties come in.
He makes an interesting comment that truth is more important than comfort. And he tries to get at the idea that the challenge is worthwhile in life. In other words, we would like to be comfortable with the way we look at the world, think that our particular interpretation is the right one, and so on. And that's easy and familiar, and it's nice to associate with people who share that particular worldview. But what he says is that the dedication to truth, the pursuit of wisdom, is really more important than this comfort. We have to give it a higher value, so that often we would end up sort of making ourselves be uncomfortable. It's again part of his general thesis that life in itself is painful, and that you have to start with that premise. So his idea is that this kind of challenge is growth-producing, that's how we will enlarge our horizons and get ourselves more in touch with reality and thus become more effective people.
He talks about that willingness to change as being one of the principal characteristics of this dedication to truth, and then talks about risking openness in terms of just that people who are open are a lot more growing. They're a lot more free from fear. Those kinds of things would characterize the person who's dedicated to the truth. And then he makes a point also in this area about total honesty, that while we ought to try to dedicate ourselves to being totally honest, he doesn't want that to mean that there are not times when it's best to withhold some of the truth from other people. But the decision to do so, as he says, must always be based on the real needs of the person from whom it's being withheld.
I
and
think
that's a difficult one. That's a difficult thing to do.
It is, but I think it's important to accept the principle to begin with. Again, what he is flying in the face of is a whole lot of the popular literature out of the therapeutic field which says be truthful at all costs, that candidness is really the great virtue. And instead, Peck is saying, oh, wait a second, there is a higher value. The higher value really is the spiritual growth of yourself and of the other person.
Right.
And therefore, sometimes that would mean not saying a particular truth because one would understand what was at stake in this situation. And I very much like that. I approve of that. And my own theological way of saying it is that charity is the highest virtue and not honesty. Charity is the one that ends up guiding us as we go along. Dan, I want to look at the last of the four of these disciplines that he wants us to use, and that is of balancing. Now, here, I mean, I'm not so sure I exactly have a hold on what he says. I think that one way is to see that it's a dialectical approach. That is, that you have to affirm one thing along with another. For example, you want to delay gratification, but there's also times when you're supposed to live spontaneously. And so he doesn't want to get into a box of saying there's just one way of going about this. He wants a balance. Now, I'm a little critical of this section of his here because I think there's a better way to approach all of this. But balance isn't a bad idea. Retaining balance in our lives, I think, is a good thing to do.
I think the essence of this particular section is really is a matter, what he talks about is giving up. That the real essence of the discipline of balancing is giving up. Giving up perhaps inappropriate patterns of behavior, giving up personality traits, giving up ideologies, giving up lifestyles, which can be extremely painful, but are necessary to maintain a balance in our lives.
That's a good point, and I think that needs to be factored in. And if you take that far enough, it's really as the Christian idea of death to life. We give up in order to achieve a richer life, which I think is something that runs throughout this whole section here. He's looking at a richer life. Scott Peck in The Road Less Traveled is trying to tell us spiritual growth is important. Don't get lost on the journey. Keep trying to work at it. And do it by discipline, the kind of discipline where you delay gratification, where you accept responsibility for the problems of life, where you're dedicated to truth, and where you try to live a balanced life.